Welcome to Abe's emergency review of operant conditioning. So in this video, I'm going to assume that you've had sort of an initial go at trying to understand operant conditioning, but maybe you feel a little bit fuzzy on what the ideas are. And so I'm going to try to make clear what the key concepts in operant conditioning are, and also try to show you some of the places that I think people tend to go wrong most often when they take tests on this subject. So the first thing that we want to make sure we understand is just generally what operant conditioning is about. And so always in operant conditioning, you're talking about this same pattern of first, step one is you engage in a behavior. And that behavior has some kind of consequences. So, for example, you might go up and put some money in a vending machine. That would be the behavior that you engage in. And the consequence is that you get a candy bar out of that vending machine. And by the way, something we'll often talk about is the term stimulus, or the plural would be stimuli. So the consequences of your behavior, we would say, that's a stimulus. Getting the candy bar is a stimulus. Stimulus just means anything that stimulates your senses. So something you taste or hear or smell. So you engage in a behavior. You get some kind of stimulus as a consequence of that behavior. And then the third part is that consequence changes your future behavior. It results in a change. Specifically, it always results in either an increase or decrease in that behavior, in the behavior. And I say the behavior because the behavior we're talking about is this one back here. So to make that clear, we might be talking about, okay, you go up to the vending machine, you put your money in the vending machine. That's the behavior you engage in. The consequences are you're presented with this stimulus of a candy bar. Those are the consequences of your behavior. And those consequences lead to an increase in the frequency with which you put money in vending machines. So you will now, because of those consequences, you will put money in that vending machine more often in the future, presumably, to get more candy bars. Now, if you understand these three steps, engaging in a behavior, having consequences of the behavior, having those consequences either increase or decrease the future frequency of that behavior, that's the core idea behind operant conditioning. And at that point, the biggest challenge now is just to add on the vocabulary that they use in operant conditioning, and that can get very confusing. So let's talk about some of the most important terms from operant conditioning. We said that when we have a consequence of our behavior, there's two different possibilities. The first possibility is that the consequence we can have a consequence that results in an increase in the behavior, or we can have a consequence that results in a decrease. So we have terms for these. The consequences that result in increases in behavior, we call this kind of consequence, we call that a reinforcer. So going up to the vending machine, putting your money in, you have the consequence of getting the candy bar. That is a reinforcer for the behavior of putting money in the vending machine. When we have a consequence that results in a decrease in the behavior, we call that a punisher. So reinforcer means increase, and punisher means decrease. So an example of a punisher would be you go up to the vending machine, you put your money in there expecting to get a candy bar, but instead some sadistic psychology professor like Abe has wired up the vending machine so that instead of getting a candy bar, you encounter an electric shock. So that leads you to engage in the behavior less often in the future. So there's a decrease in the behavior. We would call that stimulus of the electric shock, the consequence of getting the electric shock, we'd call that a punisher. So I encourage you to take a little time to make sure that you really solidly have associated the term reinforcer with the idea of an increase in the behavior and the term punisher with the idea of a decrease in the behavior. Those associations should be practically automatic to you. And the reason why that's important is because we're going to add on some additional layers of vocabulary, some additional complexity, and this is where students start to get the different terms mixed up. So let me get a little more space here. And so we said that there are two possibilities when we have a consequence. That consequence can lead to an increase in the behavior, or that consequence can lead to a decrease in the behavior. There are actually, let me just grab a different color, there are actually two other possibilities with those consequences, with the stimuli involved in those consequences, because those consequences can involve they can involve the presentation of a stimulus. So this would be, for example, we are presented with the candy bar. We put money in the vending machine. We're presented with the stimulus of the candy bar. What we mean is the candy bar is added to the situation. And the other possibility is, of course, that we could have removal of a stimulus. So this would be, for example, like you're sitting at the dinner table and your parents are making you eat all your vegetables, and so you decide you don't like that and you engage in the behavior of a temper tantrum, and the consequence of that is that your parents remove the stimulus of the vegetables. And so there are terms for these two concepts as well. The presentation of a stimulus, behaviorists refer to this as positive. This is a positive consequence. And the removal of a stimulus, they refer to as a negative consequence. Now, this is an extremely unfortunate choice of words, because in everyday language, we think of the word positive as meaning good. And we think of the term negative as meaning bad. And this is very bad, because this is not what these things mean in operant conditioning at all. Positive just means presentation of a stimulus, and negative just means removal of a stimulus. So a good way to think about this actually is in terms of mathematics. When we think of positive, we think of adding. We think of adding something to the situation. So we're adding a stimulus to the situation, we're presenting it. So it's positive. On the flip side, when we talk about removal of a stimulus, we can think of this as a subtraction. We can think of this as subtracting the stimulus, removing it from the situation. So again, I think it's very important to get these particular associations, all four of these down, really solidly. Thinking of reinforcers as meaning an increase in a behavior, punisher meaning something that leads to a decrease in the behavior, the term positive meaning presentation or addition of a stimulus, and negative meaning removal or subtraction of a stimulus. And the reason it's so important to get those down solidly is because what we're going to see next is we can actually take these things, we can take these terms, and we can start to combine them. So we can take like presentation of a stimulus, which would be positive, and the presentation of that stimulus might lead to a decrease in the behavior, in which case it would be a punisher. So we would call that a positive punisher, which would be something like presenting someone with electric shocks, so that's positive, and that leading to a decrease in the behavior, so that is a consequence that is a punisher. So in the next video, we'll go over all the different possible combinations of positive and negative, reinforcer and punisher. And we'll look at lots of examples and we'll get a lot of practice. But first, it's a good idea to make sure that you've really got these concepts down very solidly in your head so that you're thinking of what they mean almost at a subconscious automatic level.